Picture a grey morning in May 1945, somewhere in the ruins of Berlin. The Reich Chancellery lies in smoking rubble, its grand halls now filled with debris and the acrid smell of defeat. In the depths below, the Führerbunker stands silent, its concrete walls still echoing with the final conversations of a dying regime. Just days before, this underground fortress had housed not only Adolf Hitler, but a small group of individuals who knew him more intimately than perhaps anyone else alive. His personal secretary who typed his breakfast orders, his valet who laid out his uniforms each morning, his bodyguard who stood outside his door, his telephone operator who connected his calls. These were not the grand architects of Nazi ideology or the celebrated generals whose names fill history books. They were the invisible servants, the quiet witnesses, the ordinary people who had found themselves at the extraordinary center of one of history's darkest chapters. When the guns finally fell silent across Europe, these men and women faced a reckoning unlike anything they could have imagined. Their proximity to Hitler made them invaluable witnesses to the Allies, but it also marked them as potential war criminals in the eyes of a world seeking justice. Some would spend the next decade in Soviet prison camps. Others would face years of interrogation by American and British intelligence officers, desperate to understand every detail of Hitler's final days. A few would eventually profit from their experiences by writing memoirs that provided unprecedented glimpses into the private life of history's most notorious dictator. But all would discover that serving at the heart of the Third Reich had consequences that extended far beyond the bunker's concrete walls. The story of what happened to Hitler's personal staff after World War II reveals the complex machinery of justice, revenge, and survival in a shattered continent. It exposes the blurred lines between complicity and innocence, between willing participation and mere employment. Most crucially, it demonstrates how ordinary individuals who found themselves swept up in extraordinary circumstances would spend the rest of their lives grappling with the weight of history and their own choices during humanity's darkest hour. To understand the fate of these individuals, we must first comprehend the unique world they inhabited during the war's final months. Hitler's personal household operated according to routines and relationships that had developed over more than a decade of his rule. The Führer despised change in his immediate environment and surrounded himself with familiar faces who understood his habits, preferences, and increasingly erratic behavior. This created an intimate circle of servants, secretaries, valets, and bodyguards who possessed knowledge about Hitler that even high-ranking Nazi officials never acquired. Julius Schaub exemplified this phenomenon perfectly. As Hitler's chief personal adjutant and aide, Schaub had served the dictator for over 20 years, making him one of the longest-tenured members of the inner circle. Contemporary observers described him as one of Hitler's all-purpose companions from way back, a man whose loyalty had been tested through the movement's rise from obscurity to absolute power. Schaub's responsibilities extended far beyond typical secretarial duties. He managed Hitler's personal correspondence, coordinated his travel arrangements, and most significantly, maintained custody of the dictator's most sensitive documents and personal effects. The trust Hitler placed in Schaub became evident during the regime's final collapse. As Soviet artillery began falling on central Berlin, Hitler summoned his faithful adjutant for one last crucial mission. The task involved destroying evidence that could potentially embarrass the Nazi leadership or provide intelligence to the advancing Allies. On April 22nd or 23rd, 1945, Schaub methodically burned the contents of Hitler's personal safe in the bunker, along with 2 additional safes located in the Reich Chancellery above. These documents, whose exact contents remain unknown, likely included personal correspondence, financial records, and potentially compromising political materials that Hitler wanted eliminated before his death. But Schaub's final duties extended beyond Berlin itself. Hitler ordered his trusted aide to travel to Munich and the Berghof, the dictator's mountain retreat in Bavaria, to destroy the contents of additional personal safes located at these sites. This mission required Schaub to abandon the relative safety of the bunker and venture into a Germany rapidly falling under Allied occupation. His willingness to undertake such a dangerous assignment demonstrated the extraordinary personal loyalty that had characterized his relationship with Hitler for 2 decades. Schaub's last act as Hitler's adjutant possessed an almost poetic finality. Following his destruction of the personal safes, he received orders to eliminate Hitler's private train, the Führerbunker, which had served as a mobile command center throughout the war. The destruction of this luxurious railcar, with its armor plating and sophisticated communication equipment, symbolically marked the end of Hitler's to project power across his crumbling empire. Schaub carried out this final order somewhere in Austria, effectively destroying the last physical symbol of Hitler's personal authority. The collapse of Nazi Germany left Schaub in an extremely precarious position. Unlike military officers who could potentially blend into prisoner of war camps, or government officials who might claim they were merely following orders, Schaub's intimate relationship with Hitler made him a high-value target for Allied intelligence services. His decades of personal service meant he possessed detailed knowledge about Hitler's private life, personal relationships, and decision-making processes that investigators desperately wanted to understand. Recognizing the danger his identity posed, Schaub obtained false identification papers and attempted to disappear into the chaos of defeated Germany. He adopted the alias Josef Huber, a common enough name that might allow him to blend into the masses of displaced persons wandering through Central Europe. For several days, this deception appeared successful. Schaub moved through the Austrian countryside, perhaps hoping to eventually reach Switzerland or another neutral country where he could wait out the initial fury of Allied occupation. However, the net closing around former Nazi officials proved too comprehensive for even experienced operatives to evade indefinitely. On May 8, 1945, exactly 1 day after Germany's official surrender, American troops arrested Schaub in the resort town of Kitzbühel, Austria. The circumstances of his capture remain unclear from available records, but his arrest so quickly after the war's end suggests that Allied intelligence had been actively searching for him. His false identity proved insufficient protection against interrogators who had likely obtained detailed lists of Hitler's inner circle from other captured officials. Schaub's arrest marked the beginning of nearly 4 years in Allied custody, a period that would fundamentally transform his existence. Unlike prisoners of war, who enjoyed certain protections under international law, former members of Hitler's personal staff occupied a legal grey area that left them vulnerable to extended detention without formal charges. The Western Allies, particularly the Americans, viewed these individuals as crucial sources of intelligence about Hitler's final days and the internal workings of the Nazi leadership. The intelligence value Schaub represented cannot be overstated. His 2 decades of intimate access to Hitler provided investigators with a unique perspective on the dictator's personality, decision-making processes, and private beliefs. American interrogators were particularly interested in understanding how Hitler had maintained psychological control over his inner circle and whether any of his personal staff had knowledge of hidden Nazi assets or escape plans. Schaub's role in destroying sensitive documents also made him a person of interest for investigators trying to reconstruct the paper trail of Nazi crimes. During his imprisonment, Schaub faced repeated interrogations designed to extract every possible detail about his service with Hitler. These sessions likely covered everything from Hitler's daily routines and personal relationships to his reactions during crucial moments of the war. Intelligence officers would have been particularly interested in Schaub's observations about Hitler's mental state during the final months, his interactions with other Nazi leaders, and any statements he might have made about post-war plans or escape routes. The psychological pressure of these interrogations, combined with the uncertainty about his ultimate fate, must have been enormous. Schaub had witnessed the complete collapse of the political system he had served for most of his adult life. His entire identity had been built around his role as Hitler's trusted aide. And now that role had become a source of danger rather than prestige. The man who had once enjoyed privileged access to the most powerful figure in Europe now found himself powerless in the hands of his former enemies. The conditions of Schaub's imprisonment reflected the complex legal and political challenges facing the Allied powers in dealing with lower-level Nazi officials. Unlike the major war criminals who faced trial at Nuremberg, individuals like Schaub existed in a bureaucratic limbo. They were clearly associated with the Nazi regime, but their specific crimes were difficult to define and prosecute. This uncertainty prolonged their detention as Allied authorities struggled to develop consistent policies for handling the thousands of former Nazi officials in their custody. Throughout his imprisonment, Schaub maintained the discretion that had characterized his service to Hitler. Unlike some former Nazi officials, who attempted to curry favor with their captors by providing detailed information about their former colleagues, Schaub appears to have revealed only what was absolutely necessary to satisfy his interrogators. This loyalty to his former employer, even in defeat, demonstrated the depth of personal bonds that had developed within Hitler's inner circle. The release of Julius Schaub on February 17, 1949, marked the end of one chapter but the beginning of another equally challenging period. After nearly 4 years in Allied custody, he emerged into a Germany that bore little resemblance to the nation he had known. The Third Reich's grand architecture lay in ruins, its symbols erased, its ideology officially condemned. More personally devastating was the complete absence of the social structure that had defined his existence for 2 decades. The elaborate protocols, the daily routines, the sense of purpose that had characterized his service to Hitler had vanished entirely, leaving behind only memories that had become liabilities in the New World Order. Schaub's attempts Germany revealed to rebuild his life in post-war, the profound challenges facing all of Hitler's former personal staff. Unlike ordinary soldiers who could claim they had simply followed military orders, or civilians who could argue they had been uninformed about Nazi crimes, members of Hitler's household carried the burden of intimate association with history's most reviled figure. Their very proximity to Hitler made them objects of suspicion, curiosity, and often hatred among their fellow Germans, who were themselves struggling to come to terms with their nation's catastrophic defeat. The denazification process that swept through occupied Germany created additional obstacles for former members of Hitler's staff. This systematic effort to remove Nazi influence from German society subjected millions of individuals to investigation and classification according to their level of involvement with the regime. For someone like Schaub, whose entire adult life had been devoted to serving Hitler personally, the denazification tribunals represented yet another form of judgment and potential punishment. The irony was inescapable. The man who had once burned Hitler's most sensitive documents now found his own life subjected to microscopic examination by investigators, determined to catalogue every aspect of his Nazi associations. The social stigma attached to having served Hitler personally proved even more enduring than legal sanctions. Neighbours who discovered Schaub's identity often treated him with a mixture of fear and fascination that made normal relationships impossible. Some viewed him as a living reminder of Germany's shameful past, a figure whose very existence contradicted the narrative of collective innocence that many Germans preferred to embrace. Others approached him with ghoulish curiosity, hoping to extract sensational details about Hitler's private life that might satisfy their morbid fascination with the fallen dictator. Employment presented another seemingly insurmountable challenge. Schaub's resume consisted almost entirely of his service as Hitler's adjutant, hardly a qualification that would recommend him to potential employers in democratic Germany. The skills he had developed during 2 decades of managing Hitler's personal affairs, coordinating his schedule, and handling sensitive correspondence had little application in a society that had officially rejected everything the Nazi regime represented. Moreover, any employer who hired someone with Schaub's background risked association with the Nazi past, a connection that could prove commercially and socially damaging. The psychological adjustment required of former Hitler staff members like Schaub can scarcely be imagined. These individuals had not merely lost jobs or political positions. They had lost the entire framework through which they understood their place in the world. For 20 years, Schaub's identity had been inextricably linked to his role as Hitler's trusted aide. His sense of purpose, his social status, his daily routine, even his understanding of right and wrong, had been shaped by his service to the Nazi leader. The sudden absence of this defining relationship left a void that could never be adequately filled. The silence that characterized Schaub's post-war years reflected both practical necessity and psychological self-protection. Speaking publicly about his experiences would have inevitably drawn unwanted attention from journalists, investigators, and sensation seekers. More fundamentally, discussing his relationship with Hitler required confronting moral questions that had no comfortable answers. How could someone who had served history's most notorious dictator so faithfully for so long reconcile that service with the horrific crimes committed in Hitler's name? The easier path lay in silence, in attempting to disappear into the anonymity of a defeated nation struggling to rebuild itself. Yet even silence could not entirely shield former Hitler staff from the long shadow of their past. Julius Schaub died in obscurity, his story largely untold, his experiences unrecorded for posterity. Unlike some of his colleagues who would eventually write memoirs or grant interviews, Schaub carried his secrets to the grave. This silence, while understandable, represented a lost opportunity for historical understanding. His unique perspective on Hitler's personality and decision-making processes died with him, leaving historians to piece together the puzzle of the Nazi leadership's final days from fragmentary and sometimes contradictory sources. The contrast between Schaub's fate and that of other Hitler staff members who faced Soviet rather than Western Allied captivity becomes starkly apparent when examining the experiences of Heinz Linger. As Hitler's longest-serving and most trusted valet, Linger had enjoyed even more intimate access to the dictator than Schaub himself. This proximity, which had once been a source of privilege and status, became the foundation of a decade-long nightmare in Soviet prison camps that would test the very limits of human endurance. Linger's service to Hitler had begun in the early 1930s and had continued uninterrupted until the final moments in the bunker. His duties extended far beyond those of an ordinary valet. He managed Hitler's wardrobe, supervised his meals, coordinated his daily schedule, and perhaps most significantly, served as a confidant during the dictator's increasingly frequent periods of depression and rage. This intimate relationship meant that Linger possessed detailed knowledge about Hitler's personal conversations that no habits, psychological state, and private other individual could claim. The Soviet Union's obsession with confirming Hitler's death transformed Linger from a mere prisoner of war into a crucial piece of intelligence that Stalin's regime was determined to exploit fully. Unlike the Western Allies, who were primarily interested in understanding the Nazi leadership's decision-making processes, the Soviets harbored deep suspicions that Hitler might have somehow escaped the bunker alive. Stalin himself reportedly refused to believe Hitler was dead, convinced that his most dangerous enemy had fled to Argentina, or another refuge where he might reorganize resistance against the Soviet Union. This paranoia created a hellish existence for Linger and other bunker survivors who fell into Soviet hands. Their captors were not satisfied with simple confirmation of Hitler's death. They demand aspect of the dictator's final days' exhaustive details about every, cross-referencing testimonies and subjecting prisoners to repeated interrogations designed to uncover any inconsistencies that might suggest deception or hidden knowledge. The Soviets were particularly interested in Linger's role in disposing of Hitler's body, viewing this intimate involvement as potential evidence of an elaborate escape plot. The physical conditions of Soviet captivity were deliberately harsh, designed to break down psychological resistance and encourage complete cooperation with interrogators. Linger found himself transported thousands of miles from Berlin to prison camps in the Soviet-ate food, and brutal interior, where sub-zero temperatures, inadequate work regimens created a daily struggle for survival. The psychological pressure was equally intense, with interrogators alternating between promises of eventual release and threats of permanent imprisonment or execution. Linger's interrogations followed a pattern that would be repeated countless times over his decade in captivity. Soviet officers, often working with German-speaking interpreters, would demand minute-by-minute accounts of Hitler's final days, paying particular attention to any details that might suggest the possibility of escape or survival. They were especially interested in the exact circumstances of Hitler's suicide, the disposal of his body, and any conversations that might have revealed escape plans or hidden resources. The repetitive nature of these interrogations created its own form of psychological torture. Linger was forced to relive the traumatic final days in the bunker again and again, each time under intense scrutiny from interrogators looking for any variation in his account. The pressure to maintain absolute consistency in his testimony, while coping with the physical and emotional stress of imprisonment, required enormous mental strength. Any deviation from his previous statements, no matter how minor, could be interpreted as evidence of deception and result in harsher treatment. The decade Linger spent in Soviet captivity represented a complete severing from the world he had known. While imprisoned, Germany was divided into occupation zones, then separate states. The Nazi Party was disbanded and criminalized. Many of his former colleagues died in captivity or committed suicide. The entire political and social structure of Central Europe was transformed by the emerging powers. When Linger was finally released in 1955, he returned to a continent that had been fundamentally restructured in his absence. The psychological toll of his imprisonment became apparent in Linger's subsequent behavior and statements. Unlike Schaub, who maintained silence about his experiences, Linger eventually wrote a memoir that provided unprecedented insights into Hitler's private life. However, his account was colored by his traumatic captivity and his need to justify his own survival. The affectionate tone he maintained toward Hitler in his writings shocked many readers who expected more critical analysis from someone who had witnessed the dictator's final collapse firsthand. The release from Soviet captivity that Linger experienced in 1955 marked not liberation, but a different form of imprisonment within his own memories. The man who emerged from the Siberian camps bore little resemblance to the confident valet who had once managed Hitler's daily routines with military precision. 10 years of interrogation had carved deep lines into his face, while the constant mental pressure of maintaining consistent testimony under brutal conditions had left invisible scars that would never fully heal. His return to what was then West Germany revealed a homeland transformed beyond recognition, where his intimate knowledge of Hitler's private world had become both a burden and an unexpected source of potential profit. Publishers and journalists descended upon Linger like vultures sensing carrion. His first-hand account of Hitler's final moments possessed commercial value that transcended historical curiosity. In a Germany struggling to understand its own past while building a democratic future, Linger's testimony offered something no other source could provide: an insider's perspective on the human being behind the monster. The telegrams offering lucrative book deals piled up in his modest Bremen apartment, each one representing an opportunity to transform his suffering into financial security. Yet the memoir that eventually emerged from these negotiations revealed the complex psychological damage inflicted by his Soviet captivity. Rather than the critical analysis readers might have expected from someone who had witnessed Hitler's mental deterioration firsthand, Linger's account maintained an almost affectionate tone toward his former employer. This disturbing loyalty reflected not genuine admiration, but the psychological defense mechanisms he had developed to survive a decade of brutal interrogation. To maintain his sanity in Soviet camps, Linger had been forced to construct a mental narrative that justified his service to Hitler while avoiding the moral implications of that relationship. The memoir's publication in 1980 generated controversy that extended far beyond academic circles. Critics questioned whether someone who described Hitler in affectionate terms, despite witnessing his role in Germany's destruction, possessed the moral clarity necessary to serve as a historical witness. Others argued that Linger's account, however psychologically compromised, provided invaluable insights into the private dynamics that had shaped one of history's most consequential figures. The debate reflected broader tensions within German society about how to commemorate and learn from its Nazi past without inadvertently glorifying the perpetrators. Linger's later years in Bremen were marked by the peculiar celebrity that attached to surviving witnesses of historical catastrophe. Researchers and journalists made pilgrimages to his modest apartment, seeking interviews that might yield new insights into Hitler's personality or previously unknown details about the bunker's final days. These encounters often disappointed visitors who expected either dramatic revelations or expressions of remorse that never materialized. Instead, they found an elderly man whose traumatic experiences had frozen his emotional responses in patterns established decades earlier. The death of Heinz Linger in March 1980 marked the passing of one of history's most problematic witnesses. His memoir, whatever its psychological limitations, preserved details about Hitler's private life that would otherwise have been lost forever. Yet his inability or unwillingness to provide moral context for these revelations highlighted the complex challenges facing historians who must rely on testimony from individuals whose proximity to evil had fundamentally compromised their judgment. While Linger endured the harsh realities of Soviet imprisonment, other members of Hitler's personal staff faced different but equally challenging circumstances in Western Allied custody. The case of Rochus Misch, who had served simultaneously as Hitler's bodyguard and telephone operator, illustrated how individual roles and timing affected post-war fates. Misch's escape from the bunker in the early morning hours of May 2, 1945, demonstrated both courage and pragmatic recognition that remaining would serve no useful purpose. The journey through Berlin's underground tunnels that followed Hitler's suicide represented a desperate attempt to reach American or British lines before falling into Soviet hands. Misch understood, as did many of his colleagues, that capture by Stalin's forces would likely mean years of brutal interrogation or worse. The tunnel system beneath Berlin, originally constructed for civilian transportation, had become a subterranean highway for fleeing Nazi officials and German soldiers, hoping to avoid Soviet vengeance. Yet even the most carefully planned escapes often succumbed to the chaos engulfing Berlin during those final days. Misch's capture by Red Army soldiers near the city's outskirts transformed what he had hoped would be a brief period of military detention into 8 years of systematic psychological torture. His transfer to Moscow's infamous Lubyanka prison marked the beginning of an ordeal that would test every aspect of his physical and mental resilience. The interrogation techniques employed against Misch reflected the Soviet intelligence apparatus's sophisticated understanding of psychological pressure. Rather than relying solely on physical brutality, his captors employed a combination of sleep deprivation, isolation, and repetitive questioning designed to break down his resistance gradually. The goal was not simply to extract information, but to transform him into a completely compliant witness whose testimony would support whatever narrative the Soviet leadership chose to construct about Hitler's final days. Stalin's personal obsession with Hitler's fate created a climate of paranoia that affected every aspect of Misch's imprisonment. Soviet intelligence officers operated under enormous pressure to provide definitive proof of Hitler's death, knowing that failure to satisfy Stalin's demands could result in their own imprisonment or execution. This atmosphere transformed routine interrogations into life or death struggles, with prisoners like Misch serving as crucial pieces of evidence in a game whose rules they could never fully understand. The forced labor that accompanied Misch's imprisonment served multiple purposes within the Soviet system. Beyond its obvious economic value, the brutal physical demands of camp life were designed to weaken prisoners psychologically, making them more susceptible to interrogation and less likely to maintain consistent resistance to their captors' demands. The combination of inadequate nutrition, sub-zero temperatures, and backbreaking work created conditions where survival itself required complete focus, leaving little energy for maintaining elaborate deceptions or coordinated resistance. Misch's claim that he had never joined the Nazi Party became a crucial element in his eventual survival strategy. This assertion, whether entirely accurate or not, provided him with a psychological defense against Soviet interrogators who were particularly interested in identifying committed Nazi ideologists. By maintaining that his service to Hitler had been purely professional rather than political, Misch could argue that he possessed no special loyalty to Nazi ideology or hidden knowledge of escape plans and secret weapons. The 8 years Misch spent in Soviet captivity witnessed dramatic changes in the geopolitical landscape that would ultimately affect his fate. The emergence of the Cold War created new strategic calculations for Soviet leadership, who began to view German prisoners as potential assets in their struggle against Western powers, rather than simply sources of intelligence about the defunct Nazi regime. This shift in perspective gradually improved conditions for long-term prisoners and created possibilities for eventual release that had not existed immediately after the war. The process of Misch's release on December 31st, 1953, reflected broader changes in Soviet policy toward German prisoners of war. Stalin's death earlier that year had created opportunities for policy modifications that his successors could implement without appearing to contradict the former dictator's wishes. The new leadership recognized that continued imprisonment of low-level Nazi officials served little strategic purpose and generated negative publicity that complicated Soviet diplomatic efforts in Western Europe. Misch's return to Berlin on the final day of 1953 symbolized not only his personal liberation, but the gradual normalization of relations between the Soviet Union and the state. His arrival emerging West German in what was then West Berlin provided American and British intelligence services with their first opportunity to debrief someone who had been present during Hitler's final days and subsequently experienced 8 years of Soviet interrogation methods firsthand. The debriefing process that followed Misch's return revealed the sophisticated techniques Soviet intelligence had employed to extract information from Nazi prisoners. His accounts of repetitive questioning, psychological pressure, and deliberate misinformation campaigns provided Western intelligence agencies with valuable insights into Soviet interrogation methods that could be applied to their own operations during the intensifying Cold War. In this sense, Misch's suffering served strategic purposes that extended far beyond his individual case. The house in Berlin's Rudow district, where Misch spent his remaining years, became an unlikely pilgrimage site for historians, journalists, and curious citizens seeking direct contact with living history. His willingness to receive visitors and discuss his experiences, unlike the silence maintained by individuals such as Julius Schaub, reflected both his need to process traumatic memories and his recognition that his story possessed historical value that transcended personal comfort. The interviews Misch granted during his later years revealed the complex psychological legacy of his service to Hitler and subsequent imprisonment. His consistent claim of political innocence while maintaining detail and personal relationships illustrated knowledge of Hitler's private habits, the cognitive dissonance that characterized many former Nazi officials who had survived the war's aftermath. The ability to simultaneously acknowledge intimate familiarity with Hitler while denying any ideological commitment to Nazi goals required mental gymnastics that became second nature to those seeking to rebuild their lives in democratic Germany. Misch's death in September 2013 marked the end of an era in more ways than one. As historians noted, his passing eliminated one of the last direct connections to the Führerbunker's final days, closing a chapter of living memory that had provided invaluable insights into one of history's most significant moments. Yet his death also highlighted the broader challenges facing societies that must preserve historical memory while avoiding the romanticization of those who witnessed evil firsthand. The contrast between male and female staff members' post-war experiences became particularly evident in examining the fate of Hitler's secretaries, who faced different challenges and often enjoyed more varied outcomes than their male counterparts. The case of Traudl Junge, who had typed Hitler's final will and testament just hours before his suicide, demonstrated how gender, timing, and individual choices could dramatically affect survival prospects in the chaos following Germany's defeat. Junge's escape from the bunker as part of Wilhelm Monke's breakout group represented one of the war's final military operations, a desperate attempt to reach American or British lines before Soviet forces could seal off all escape routes from central Berlin. The group's composition, including Hitler's personal pilot, his chief bodyguard, and several secretaries, reflected the intimate nature of Hitler's final household and the personal loyalty that had bound these individuals together during the regime's collapse. The journey through Berlin's battle-scarred streets required courage that few civilians possessed. Soviet and German forces continued fighting in scattered pockets throughout the city, while trigger-happy soldiers from both sides posed constant threats to anyone moving through contested areas. Artillery shells and sniper fire made every street crossing potentially fatal, while the breakdown of military discipline had created conditions where rape and murder of civilians had become commonplace. The group's ability to navigate this urban hellscape reflected both careful planning and extraordinary luck. Moving primarily through subway tunnels and basement connections, they avoided the main streets where Soviet patrols had established checkpoints designed to capture fleeing Nazi officials. The underground passages beneath Berlin had become a vast network of hiding places and escape routes, filled with terrified civilians, wounded soldiers, and desperate officials, all seeking salvation in the city's buried arteries. Yet even the most meticulously planned escapes could not account for the random violence that characterized Berlin's final hours. The group's capture near the Elbe River demonstrated how quickly fortune could reverse in those chaotic days. One moment, they were within sight of potential freedom. The next, they found themselves staring into the barrels of Soviet rifles held by soldiers who had been specifically instructed to watch for high-value prisoners attempting to flee westward. The initial interrogations that followed revealed the particular interest Soviet intelligence placed in female staff members who had been present during Hitler's final days. Unlike male prisoners who were often viewed primarily through military or political lenses, the secretaries represented a unique category of witness whose intimate access to Hitler's private thoughts and conversations during his final hours made them invaluable sources of intelligence. Their gender provided them with certain protections under international law, but also created different forms of vulnerability within the Soviet prison system. Junge's testimony about Hitler's final will and testament became a focal point of Soviet interrogation efforts. The document she had typed contained not only Hitler's political testament, but also his personal will, disposing of his private possessions and expressing his final thoughts about the war's outcome. Soviet investigators were particularly interested in any references to hidden assets, escape plans, or instructions to surviving Nazi officials that might indicate ongoing resistance activities. The psychological pressure applied to extract these details reflected sophisticated understanding of human vulnerability under stress. Rather than employing the brutal physical methods often used against male prisoners, interrogators dealing with the secretaries relied more heavily on psychological manipulation, threats against family members, and promises of improved conditions in exchange for cooperation. These techniques proved equally effective while avoiding the international complications that might arise from reports of violence against female prisoners. The months of imprisonment that followed tested Junge's resolve in ways that her comfortable pre-war life had never prepared her for. The transition from typing Hitler's personal correspondence in luxuriously appointed offices to surviving in overcrowded prison cells represented a psychological shock that few individuals could have absorbed without lasting damage. The constant uncertainty about her ultimate fate, combined with repeated interrogations about intimate details of Hitler's private life, created emotional trauma that would persist long after her physical release. The eventual transfer to American custody marked a crucial turning point in Junger's post-war experience. Unlike their Soviet counterparts, American intelligence officers approached the interrogation of Hitler's secretaries with different objectives and methods. Rather than seeking evidence of ongoing Nazi resistance or hidden escape plots, they were primarily interested in understanding Hitler's personality, decision-making processes, and the internal dynamics of his inner circle during the war's final phases. This shift in interrogation focus created opportunities for Junger to present herself in more favorable terms. Her youth at the time of her employment, her limited political involvement, and her role as a mere stenographer, rather than a policy advisor, allowed her to construct a narrative of innocence that resonated with American investigators, who were themselves struggling to understand how ordinary individuals had become complicit in extraordinary evil. The American approach to denazification created additional opportunities for rehabilitation that had not existed under Soviet custody. Unlike the harsh ideological purification demanded by Stalin's regime, American denazification efforts focused more on practical considerations of rebuilding German society while removing the most dangerous Nazi elements. This pragmatic approach allowed individuals like Junger to demonstrate their commitment to democratic values through cooperation with Allied authorities, rather than enduring indefinite punishment for their wartime associations. Junger's release and subsequent return to civilian life illustrated both the possibilities and limitations of rehabilitation in post-war Germany. Her secretarial skills, refined during years of handling Hitler's correspondence, proved transferable to legitimate employment in the emerging democratic state. Yet the shadow of her Nazi associations followed her throughout her career, creating a constant tension between her desire for normalcy and the historical significance of her wartime experiences. The decision to eventually publish her memoirs represented a complex calculation involving personal catharsis, historical responsibility, and financial opportunity. Unlike male staff members whose accounts often focused on political or military aspects of their service, Junger's memoir provided unprecedented insights into Hitler's personal life, his relationships with women, and the domestic atmosphere within his private quarters. These intimate details satisfied public curiosity while serving legitimate historical purposes, though they also raised uncomfortable questions about profiting from proximity to evil. The moral framework Junger employed to justify her wartime service reflected broader patterns of self-deception that characterized many former Nazi officials. Her claims of ignorance about the Holocaust and other Nazi crimes, while maintaining detailed knowledge of Hitler's personal preferences and daily routines, illustrated the cognitive compartmentalization that had allowed ordinary individuals to function within an extraordinary evil system. This psychological defense mechanism, while understandable, complicated efforts to extract historical truth from personal testimony. The public reception of Junger's memoir revealed the complex relationship between historical curiosity and moral judgment that would characterize German society's approach to its Nazi past for generations. Readers simultaneously condemned her complicity while consuming her revelations with voyeuristic fascination. This contradiction reflected deeper tensions within German culture about confronting historical guilt, while satisfying legitimate intellectual curiosity about the period's most significant figures. Christa Schroeder's post-war experience provided another perspective on how Hitler's female staff navigated the challenges of defeat, interrogation, and rehabilitation. As one of Hitler's longest-serving secretaries, Schroeder possessed intimate knowledge spanning nearly the entire duration of Nazi rule, making her testimony invaluable to Allied investigators seeking to understand the evolution of Hitler's personality and decision-making processes throughout the war. Her evacuation from Berlin on April 20, 1945, reflected Hitler's belated recognition that the capital's fall had become inevitable. The decision to fly his most trusted secretaries to safety at the Berghof demonstrated both his personal attachment to these women and his understanding that their survival might serve historical purposes that extended beyond the immediate military situation. This evacuation also revealed the informal hierarchy that existed within Hitler's household, with the longest-serving and most trusted staff receiving preferential treatment during the regime's final collapse. The flight to Bavaria represented one of the war's final examples of Nazi organizational efficiency operating amid complete strategic breakdown. Despite the disintegration of German air defenses and the constant threat of Allied fighter attacks, Hitler's personal aircraft managed to transport key staff members to relative safety in the Alpine Redoubt. This successful operation demonstrated the loyalty and competence that had characterized the Führer's personal service throughout his rule, even as the broader Nazi state collapsed around them. Schroeder's subsequent arrest near Berchtesgaden illustrated the comprehensive nature of Allied efforts to locate and interrogate former Nazi officials. The intelligence networks that identified her location so quickly after the war's end reflected months of preparation by Allied investigators who had compiled detailed lists of Hitler's associates and their likely hiding places. Her capture also demonstrated the futility of attempting to disappear in occupied Germany, where local populations were often willing to provide information about suspicious individuals in exchange for Allied favour. The interrogation process that followed revealed the particular value American intelligence placed on long-serving members of Hitler's household staff. Unlike recent arrivals who possessed limited knowledge of the dictator's evolution over time, Schroeder could provide insights into how Hitler's personality, health, and decision-making had changed throughout the war years. Her observations about his increasing paranoia, physical deterioration, and emotional volatility offered crucial evidence for Allied efforts to understand the psychological factors that had influenced Nazi policy during the conflict's final phases. The French liaison officer's involvement in Schroeder's interrogation reflected the international nature of Allied efforts to document Nazi crimes and understand the regime's internal workings. Albert Zola's background and expertise provided unique perspectives that complemented American interrogation techniques, while his linguistic skills facilitated more nuanced conversations about subtle aspects of Hitler's personality and behavior that might have been lost in translation. The assessment of Schroeder as rather stupid, dumpy, and an ardent Nazi by American intelligence officers revealed both the biases and limitations of Allied interrogation efforts. These superficial judgments often reflected cultural prejudices rather than accurate psychological analysis, potentially limiting the quality of intelligence extracted from valuable witnesses. Such characterizations also demonstrated how personal appearance and demeanor could influence official assessments in ways that had little relationship to an individual's actual knowledge or historical significance. The 3-year imprisonment that followed Schroeder's arrest reflected the complex legal and political challenges facing Allied authorities in dealing with lower-level Nazi officials. Unlike major war criminals who faced specific charges at Nuremberg, individuals like Schroeder existed in a bureaucratic grey area where their association with Hitler made them suspects, but their specific crimes remained difficult to define and prosecute. This legal uncertainty prolonged their detention, while Allied authorities developed consistent policies for handling the thousands of former Nazi officials in their custody. The reclassification of Schroeder from war criminal to collaborator illustrated the evolving Allied understanding of individual responsibility within the Nazi system. This distinction recognized that proximity to Hitler did not automatically constitute criminal behavior, while acknowledging that such associations required investigation and potential punishment. The collaborator designation carried less severe legal consequences, while still acknowledging complicity in the Nazi regime's activities. Schroeder's eventual release in May 1948 coincided with broader changes in Allied occupation policies that reflected the emerging Cold War's strategic priorities. The Western powers' growing concern about Soviet expansion had begun to outweigh their initial focus on thoroughly purging German society of Nazi influences. This shift created opportunities for rehabilitation that had not existed immediately after the war, allowing individuals like Schröder to rebuild their lives within the emerging democratic West German state. The post-war employment Schröder found in Munich demonstrated both the practical challenges facing former Nazi officials and the gradual normalization of their status within German society. Her secretarial skills, refined during years of handling Hitler's correspondence, proved valuable in a recovering economy that needed experienced administrative personnel. Yet her Nazi associations undoubtedly limited her career opportunities and social relationships, creating a permanent tension between professional competence and historical baggage. The memoir Schröder eventually published represented another example of how former Hitler staff members sought to control the narrative of their wartime experiences while potentially profiting from their historical significance. Her book provided intimate details about Hitler's private life that satisfied public curiosity while serving legitimate scholarly purposes, though critics questioned whether such publications inadvertently contributed to the mystique surrounding Nazi leadership rather than promoting genuine historical understanding. The transformation of these personal testimonies into commercial products reflected broader tensions within German society about how to commemorate and learn from the Nazi period without inadvertently glorifying its perpetrators. Publishers recognized the commercial value of insider accounts while historians debated their reliability and moral implications. This controversy highlighted the complex relationship between historical curiosity, commercial exploitation, and moral responsibility that would characterize discussions of Nazi history for decades to come. The death of Christa Schröder in 1984 marked the passing of another direct link to Hitler's private world, eliminating a source of first-hand knowledge that could never be replaced. Her memoir, whatever its limitations, preserved details about Hitler's personality and daily routines that would otherwise have been lost forever. Yet her reluctance to provide moral context for these revelations highlighted the ongoing challenges facing historians who must rely on testimony from individuals whose proximity to evil had fundamentally compromised their judgment and perspective. The contrasting fates of Hitler's personal staff members revealed how individual circumstances, timing, and choices could dramatically affect survival prospects in the chaos following Nazi Germany's defeat. Some endured decades of imprisonment and interrogation, while others managed relatively quick transitions to normal civilian life. These variations illustrated both the arbitrary nature of post-war justice and the complex factors that determined individual outcomes during this period of unprecedented social and political transformation. The broader implications of these personal stories extended far beyond individual biographical details. The experiences of Hitler's staff provided crucial insights into the nature of complicity, the psychology of evil, and the challenges facing societies attempting to rebuild themselves after experiencing totalitarian rule. Their testimonies, despite their limitations and biases, preserved invaluable historical evidence while raising profound questions about memory, responsibility, and the possibility of redemption after participation in systematic atrocity. The web of relationships that had bound Hitler's personal staff together began unraveling even before the bunker's final collapse. Yet the shared trauma of those last days created bonds that would persist through decades of separation and silence. While some staff members found themselves scattered across Soviet prison camps, others faced the equally daunting challenge of navigating Western Allied interrogation centers, where their knowledge commanded both respect and suspicion. The divergent paths these individuals followed revealed not only the arbitrary nature of post-war justice, but the profound ways that proximity to absolute power had shaped their understanding of loyalty, duty, and moral responsibility. Johannes Schell's unique Hent position as the bunker's master electrician provided him with a different perspective on both the regime's final collapse and the immediate aftermath that followed Hitler's death. Unlike the personal servants and secretaries whose duties had revolved around Hitler's comfort and preferences, Henschel's responsibilities were purely technical, focused on maintaining the complex systems that kept the underground fortress operational during its final siege. This distinction would prove crucial in determining his post-war fate, as Soviet interrogators recognized the value of someone who could explain the bunker's technical specifications while posing minimal ideological threat. The decision to remain in the bunker after virtually everyone else had fled or committed suicide demonstrated both professional dedication and practical recognition that the field hospital above required continued power and water to function. This choice transformed Henschel from a mere technician into one of the final witnesses to the complete dissolution of Nazi authority. His presence during those last hours provided Soviet investigators with detailed technical intelligence about the bunker's layout, security systems, and potential vulnerabilities that complemented the personal testimonies extracted from other survivors. The surrender Henschel offered to advancing Soviet troops reflected a pragmatic understanding that resistance would serve no useful purpose. Unlike military officers who might have felt obligated to continue fighting, or political officials who feared retribution for their ideological commitments, Henschel possessed no illusions about his strategic value or his chances of escape. His willingness to cooperate with Soviet forces from the moment of capture established a foundation of compliance that would influence his treatment throughout the subsequent imprisonment. The technical knowledge Henschel possessed proved immediately valuable to Soviet forces attempting to secure and understand the bunker complex. His detailed explanations of electrical systems, ventilation networks, and structural modifications provided crucial intelligence for engineers tasked with preventing potential sabotage or booby traps that might have been left behind by fleeing Nazi officials. This cooperation demonstrated his practical value to his captors while distinguishing him from prisoners whose knowledge was purely historical or personal. The 4-year imprisonment that followed reflected both Soviet appreciation for Henschel's cooperation and their systematic approach to extracting every possible detail about the bunker's final days. Unlike the brutal interrogations endured by individuals such as Linger and Misch, Henschel's sessions focused primarily on technical matters that posed no direct challenge to Soviet propaganda narratives about Hitler's death. This distinction allowed for more civilized treatment, while still ensuring comprehensive documentation of his experiences and observations. The release Henschel received in April 1949 coincided with broader Soviet recognition that continued personnel served technical strategic of purely imprisonment little purpose. His specialized knowledge had been thoroughly documented, his cooperation had been exemplary, and his lack of political involvement made him an ideal candidate for early release as part of broader diplomatic efforts to improve relations with the emerging West German state. This calculation reflected the pragmatic considerations that increasingly influenced Soviet policy toward German prisoners as the Cold War intensified. The return to civilian life that followed presented Henschel with challenges that differed significantly from those faced by more prominent members of Hitler's staff. His technical expertise remained valuable in a Germany desperate to rebuild its infrastructure, while his relatively obscure role during the Nazi period attracted minimal public attention or historical curiosity. This anonymity, while limiting his potential to profit from memoir writing or interviews, provided the privacy necessary to rebuild a normal existence without constant reminders of his wartime associations. The quiet death Henschel experienced in 1982 symbolized both the successful rehabilitation of lower-level Nazi personnel and the gradual fading of direct connections to the regime's final moments. Unlike colleagues whose testimonies became historical documents or commercial products, his story remained largely untold, preserved only in classified Soviet interrogation files and scattered references in academic studies. This obscurity reflected both personal preference and the limited public interest in technical personnel, compared to the secretaries and valets who had enjoyed intimate access to Hitler's private world. The contrast between Henschel's relatively smooth reintegration and the prolonged struggles faced by more visible staff members highlighted the complex factors that determined individual post-war outcomes. Technical competence, political neutrality, and willingness to cooperate with Allied authorities proved more valuable than ideological purity or personal loyalty to Nazi leadership. These distinctions would influence not only immediate survival prospects, but long-term possibilities for rehabilitation within democratic German society. The female secretaries who had served Hitler faced unique challenges that combined gender-based vulnerabilities with the historical significance of their intimate knowledge about the dictator's private life. Their experiences revealed how societal expectations about women's roles could both protect and endanger individuals caught in the machinery of post-war justice. The assumption that women had been less politically involved than their male counterparts often worked to their advantage during interrogations, yet their detailed knowledge of Hitler's personal habits made them valuable witnesses whose testimonies could never be entirely dismissed or forgotten. Gerda Christian's post-war journey illustrated the complex personal relationships that had developed within Hitler's inner circle and how these bonds influenced individual choices during the regime's collapse. Her marriage to one's military of Hitler aides had created personal stakes in the Nazi hierarchy that extended beyond mere employment, making her flight from Berlin both a professional duty and a personal mission to preserve what remained of the world she had known. The failure of her husband to remain with her until the end revealed how the bunker's final days had tested every relationship and exposed the true character of those who claimed loyalty to Hitler and his cause. The divorce that followed Christian's return from captivity demonstrated how the war's trauma had fundamentally altered personal relationships among Hitler's former staff. The bonds that had seemed unbreakable during the regime's ascendancy proved fragile when subjected to the extreme pressures of defeat, imprisonment, and moral reckoning. Her husband's absence during the bunker's final days had violated an unspoken code of loyalty that she found impossible to forgive, suggesting that for some staff members, personal honor had become more important than survival itself. The friendship Christian maintained with Werner Naumann revealed the persistent networks that connected former Nazi officials long after their regime's destruction. These relationships provided both emotional support and practical assistance in navigating the challenges of post-war life, yet they also created ongoing vulnerabilities as Allied authorities monitored such connections for signs of continued Nazi activity. Naumann's arrest in 1953 on charges of leading a neo-Nazi group illustrated how associations formed during the Third Reich could continue to generate legal and political complications years after the war's end. The hotel employment Christian found in Düsseldorf represented both the practical necessities of survival and the limited opportunities available to women with Nazi associations in post-war Germany. Her administrative skills, refined during years of managing Hitler's correspondence, proved transferable to civilian hospitality work that required discretion and attention to detail. Yet this employment also represented a dramatic fall from the prestigious position she had once held at the center of European political power, highlighting the complete reversal of fortune that had befallen all of Hitler's former associates. The cancer that eventually claimed Christian's life in 1997 marked the end of another direct link to Hitler's private world, eliminating yet another source of first-hand testimony about the regime's final days. Her death at age 83 meant that she had lived nearly as long after Hitler's death as she had before it, suggesting the profound ways that brief periods of historical proximity could define entire lifetimes. The relative obscurity of her final years reflected both personal preference and the gradual diminishment of public interest in Nazi survivors as direct memory gave way to historical scholarship. The systematic approach Allied intelligence services employed in locating and interrogating Hitler's female staff revealed sophisticated understanding of their potential value as witnesses. Unlike male prisoners, who were often viewed primarily through military or political frameworks, the secretaries represented a unique category whose intimate access to Hitler's private thoughts and personal relationships provided insights that no other sources could offer. Their detailed knowledge of his daily routines, personal preferences, and emotional reactions during crucial moments made them invaluable for psychological profiles that Allied analysts were constructing. The varying treatment these women received reflected both individual circumstances and broader Allied policies toward female prisoners. Those captured by Western forces generally experienced more civilized conditions and shorter detention periods compared to their counterparts who fell into Soviet hands. Yet even American and British interrogators recognized the importance of maintaining psychological pressure sufficient to ensure complete cooperation while avoiding the international complications that might arise from reports of abuse against female prisoners. The denazification process that affected all former Nazi personnel created particular challenges for women whose roles had been largely administrative rather than policy-making. The assumption that secretaries and household staff had possessed limited political influence often worked in their favor during classification proceedings, allowing them to be categorized as followers rather than activists. Yet their intimate knowledge of Nazi leadership made it impossible to dismiss their roles entirely, creating a legal grey area that prolonged uncertainty about their ultimate fate. The memoirs that several female staff members eventually published provided unprecedented insights into Hitler's private life while raising complex questions about the commercialization of historical testimony. These accounts satisfied legitimate scholarly curiosity about the dictator's personality and behavior, yet they also generated controversy about whether individuals who had served at the heart of the Nazi regime should profit from their proximity to evil. The moral framework these women employed to justify their wartime service often emphasized their limited political understanding and their focus on personal rather than ideological loyalty. The psychological impact of serving Hitler personally and witnessing the regime's collapse created lasting trauma that influenced these women throughout their remaining years. The transition from positions of relative privilege and importance to the anonymity of post-war civilian life required enormous psychological adjustment. Many struggled with depression, anxiety, and social isolation as they attempted to rebuild identities that had been fundamentally shaped by their service to history's most notorious dictator. The social stigma attached to having worked intimately with Hitler created ongoing challenges in forming normal relationships and maintaining employment. Neighbors who discovered their identities often reacted with mixtures of fascination, horror, and suspicion that made ordinary social interactions difficult or impossible. The burden of carrying such historically significant yet morally compromised experiences created a form of psychological imprisonment that persisted long after physical captivity had ended. The gradual emergence of these women's stories into public consciousness reflected broader changes in how German society approached its Nazi past. The initial silence and shame that characterized the immediate post-war period gradually gave way to more complex discussions about complicity, responsibility, and the possibility of redemption. Yet these conversations often struggled to reconcile legitimate historical curiosity with moral judgments about individuals whose proximity to evil had provided them with unique but troubling perspectives on one of history's darkest chapters. The death of the last surviving female staff members in the late 20th and early 21st centuries marked the end of living memory about Hitler's private world. Their passing eliminated irreplaceable sources of first-hand testimony, while highlighting the broader challenges facing historians who must preserve and interpret accounts from individuals whose credibility had been compromised by their association with systematic atrocity. The legacy these women left behind included both valuable historical insights and troubling questions about the nature of complicity that would continue to influence scholarship for generations to come. The broader patterns that emerged from studying the post-war experiences of Hitler's personal staff revealed fundamental truths about the nature of power, loyalty, and moral responsibility under totalitarian rule. These individuals had found themselves at the center of historical events that would define the 20th century, yet their proximity to ultimate evil had compromised their ability to serve as reliable witnesses or moral guides. Their varied fates illustrated both the arbitrary nature of post-war justice and the complex factors that determined individual survival in the aftermath of unprecedented political and social collapse. The intelligence value these staff members represented to Allied authorities extended far beyond their first-hand knowledge of Hitler's final days. Their testimonies provided crucial insights into the psychology of totalitarian leadership, the internal dynamics of dictatorial regimes, and the ways that ordinary individuals become complicit in extraordinary evil. Yet the very factors that made their accounts historically valuable also raised questions about their reliability and moral authority that complicated efforts to extract objective truth from subjective memory. The rehabilitation some staff members achieved within post-war German society demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of democratic integration following totalitarian rule. Those who successfully rebuilt their lives often did so by emphasizing their limited political involvement, while downplaying the moral implications of their service to Hitler. This strategy allowed for practical reintegration, while avoiding the deeper reckonings that might have provided more meaningful historical lessons about complicity and responsibility. The commercial success some achieved through memoir writing and media appearances revealed complex tensions between historical preservation and potential exploitation. Their accounts preserved invaluable details about Hitler's private life and the regime's final collapse. Yet the financial benefits they derived from these revelations raised uncomfortable questions about profiting from proximity to atrocity. These moral ambiguities reflected broader challenges facing societies attempting to commemorate traumatic histories without inadvertently glorifying their perpetrators. The silence maintained by others represented a different approach to managing the burden of historical complicity. Those who chose not to speak publicly about their experiences often did so from recognition that their testimonies might be misinterpreted or misused by those seeking to rehabilitate Nazi ideology. Yet this silence also eliminated potentially valuable historical evidence, creating gaps in the historical record that could never be filled. The psychological toll, visible in virtually all surviving staff members, demonstrated the profound personal costs of serving at the heart of totalitarian power. Depression, social isolation, and ongoing trauma characterized the later lives of individuals who had once enjoyed privileged positions within Hitler's inner circle. Their suffering, while genuine, existed alongside the infinitely greater suffering of the regime's victims, creating complex moral calculations about sympathy and judgment that defied easy resolution. The transformation of Hitler's personal staff from intimate confidants to historical curiosities reflected broader shifts in how democratic societies approach the complex legacy of totalitarian rule. Their testimonies, extracted through years of interrogation and occasionally volunteered through memoir publication, became primary sources for understanding the banality of evil that Hannah Arendt would later identify as characteristic of totalitarian systems. Yet these accounts also revealed the profound moral blindness that had allowed ordinary individuals to function within extraordinary evil structures without apparent recognition of their complicity. The interrogation techniques employed by different Allied powers reflected not only their immediate intelligence needs, but their broader philosophical approaches to justice and rehabilitation. Soviet methods emphasized psychological pressure and physical deprivation, designed to break down resistance and extract every possible detail about Hitler's final days. American and British approaches tended toward more sophisticated psychological manipulation, combined with promises of eventual release in exchange for cooperation. French interrogators often focused on specific aspects of Nazi occupation policies that had affected their homeland directly. These varying methodologies produced testimonies of dramatically different quality and reliability. Prisoners subjected to Soviet brutality often provided whatever information they believed their captors wanted to hear, regardless of its accuracy. Those interrogated by Western powers sometimes felt more comfortable revealing genuine insights, yet they also had greater opportunities to shape their narratives in ways that minimized their own culpability, while emphasizing their limited agency within the Nazi system. The documentation produced through these interrogation processes became foundational texts for post-war understanding of Nazi leadership and decision-making. Intelligence reports based on staff testimonies influenced everything from war crimes prosecutions to academic research about totalitarian psychology. Yet the circumstances under which this information was obtained raised persistent questions about its reliability and the ethical implications of using testimony extracted under duress. The gradual release of Hitler's staff members throughout the late 1940s and 1950s coincided with broader changes in Allied occupation policies that reflected emerging Cold War priorities. The initial focus on thorough denazification gradually gave way to more pragmatic considerations about rebuilding Western Europe as a bulwark against Soviet expansion. This shift created opportunities for rehabilitation that had not existed immediately after the war, allowing former Nazi personnel to reintegrate into society through demonstrated loyalty to democratic principles. The process of reintegration varied dramatically depending on individual circumstances, personal choices, and the specific communities where former staff members attempted to rebuild their lives. Some found acceptance through quiet demonstration of changed values and constructive contributions to their new democratic society. Others faced persistent suspicion and social ostracism that made normal relationships and employment extremely difficult to maintain. Today, as the last witnesses to history's most devastating regime fade into memory, their testimonies remain both invaluable and troubling. These ordinary individuals who found themselves at the epicenter of extraordinary evil remind us that proximity to power carries consequences that extend far beyond immediate circumstances. Their varied fates illustrate humanity's capacity for both complicity and survival, revealing uncomfortable truths about moral responsibility that continue to challenge our understanding of justice, memory, and redemption in the shadow of atrocity.